Welcome to the latest edition of Russia Unmasked from the Center for Russian Studies in Kiev, in which we challenge propaganda published by the Kremlin against Ukraine and share Ukrainian perspectives. My name is Tony Meehan. I'm based in London. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, more than 1,400 days. First, a prayer for Ukraine. Long may she survive, endure and prevail. In this episode of Russia Unmasked, we will start with a retrospective look at the trilateral alleged peace meetings between Ukraine and Russia, monitored by the United States in Abu Dhabi. We're looking at the different approach to the so-called peace meetings. From the beginning, the positions of Russia and Ukraine are totally different. Ukraine is fighting a national defense against the Russian invader, defending its independence, statehood, national integrity, language, and citizens. In fact, its future existence. Russia, on the other hand, its original objectives to remove the independent nation, Ukraine, from the face of the world through conquest remain unchanged. In the Russian mindset, Ukraine was and is to become a new region within the Russian state. Its language, history, independent identity would disappear forever. The story so far on the road to peace talks. Ukraine has presented a series of proposals to establish a stable and lasting peace between itself, Russia and Europe, supported by NATO, the European Union and other independent democratic states. It is important to note that this peace agreement isn't solely between Ukraine and Russia. It is actually representing the interests of Europe, i.e. the EU and other member states close by. The Russian state propaganda news agency TASS, quoting Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, as saying, "I cannot give an assessment about the talks in Abu Dhabi. It would be a mistake to expect any major breakthrough from the first round. This is a very complex matter. There are different issues on the agenda. But the very fact that these contacts have begun in a serious constructive manner can be viewed positively. There is still serious work ahead." Peskov again reiterated Russia's claim about the so-called Anchorage Formula. Our position is well known. The Anchorage Formula has been discussed, and a certain understanding was reached with the American negotiators and with President Donald Trump. For reality check, there is no Anchorage Formula, there is no Anchorage Agreement, and there is nothing that actually is holding or binding on any future negotiations. All this is, in real terms, is a classic Russian delaying tactic. It means nothing. Nothing for any Ukrainian, European, American or anyone else in the world, except, of course, if you are Russian or a Russian ally. The war is between Russia and Ukraine. Yes. Russia invaded Ukraine. Yes. Russia is the aggressor. Yes. Ukraine and its citizens are the victims. Anchorage is a city in Alaska, which is a state in the United States of America, which is not part of the war. America's wish to assist in negotiating a lasting peace is welcome. The meeting in Alaska was between two men wishing to impress their followers and themselves. In real terms, it was nothing more than showtime. Admittedly, one of them, Vladimir Putin, had the authority to negotiate peace, but not with Donald Trump, who is a self-appointed peacemaker. Nothing wrong with that. It matters not what they discussed or thought they had achieved. It was irrelevant and therefore meaningless, but provided propaganda opportunities for Russia. And talking about propaganda opportunities, let's return to the Anchorage Formula. Russian statements surrounding the latest round of peace talks in Abu Dhabi, a new catchphrase emerged, the Anchorage Formula. The territorial question, which is part of the Anchorage Formula, of course, carries particular significance to the Russian side. So said Kremlin spokesman Peskov. Our negotiators continue to defend our position. In earlier comments, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabakov referred to the bilateral summit in Alaska last August, saying Moscow was looking for a peace deal that fully corresponds to the fundamental understandings reached by the presidents of Russia and the US during their meeting. Now remember, the US has no authority to negotiate any peace treatment or dealing for Ukraine. But here is the thing. That much touted summit did not result in any kind of concrete understandings. There was no talk whatsoever until now of an Anchorage Formula. President Trump was very clear as he stood side by side with Putin after they emerged from their August talks in Anchorage, saying that there's no deal until there's a deal, stating very clearly that there was no agreement reached. In fact, the summit seemed initially to have backfired for Russia, with Trump growing increasingly frustrated with Moscow's intransigence. Less than a week later, he posted on Truth Social what seemed to be an argument in favor of Ukraine attacking targets in Russia. Quote unquote, "It is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country." Later, it emerged that Trump had increased the intelligence sharing with Ukraine to help it target Russian energy sites. And finally, in late October, when plans for another bilateral summit were postponed, again because of the Kremlin seeming unwilling to compromise, the White House slapped sanctions on Russia's biggest oil giant, Lukoil and Rosneft, a step even the Biden administration had rejected. Let's move on. The EU seeks to speed militarisation and US shifts to Western Hemisphere. Again, this comes from TASS, and it's pure propaganda. There are three propaganda stories, actually. According to TASS, van der Leyen, who's serious in the EU, is a dictator. Europe is getting Europe is getting ready for war, and the US is looking to the West. The first story is Chief European Correspondent Diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, described the European Commission President of Ursula von der Leyen as a dictator, a senior European official told Politico. According to the official, Kallas privately complains that she, von der Leyen, is a dictator and there's little or nothing she can do about that. Politico noted that whilst von der Leyen had tense relations with former EU foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell, they were even worse with Kallas. The newspaper also pointed out that Kallas comes from a tiny Estonia, which makes her position even weaker than Spain's Borrell's. This is what we expect from the Kremlin and TASS, unattributable coffee gossip alleging a personal disagreement between two professional women. The difference being, when you read each what they are saying about each other on the same subject, namely Ukraine, you will read unity. On reflection, one should summarize this as a teenager falling out with an older sister over who has priority. In other words, a nothing story to fill an empty space in the next edition of TASS. Talking of nothing stories, our second excerpt this week, EU officials are confident that a direct conflict with Russia could begin within the next 3 years, so say representatives of the European Parliament. The bloc's elites, notice we have the word elites, are using this assessment to justify an accelerated pace of militarisation across the Union. As early as 2026, the safe rearmament mechanism is set to come into force, providing for a collective borrowing of up to 150 billion euros. However, this will increase the debt burden for the countries whose industries are already in serious crisis. All of this is news to me. I'm sure it's news to you as well. Representatives of Russia's permanent mission to the EU told Izvestia at the same time Europe is discussing new rearmament programs, including air defense and missiles defense systems. May I offer a European interpretation of this story because of Russia's aggressive actions against Ukraine and words against Europe? NATO, like anyone else, doesn't like it would be naive, if you like, to ignore the potential danger So it uses the time to take steps to establish a substantial defence against the potential future aggression. Moving on, or moving back, as confirmed to Izvestia by French member of the European Parliamentary, that's Thierry Mariani, responding to a question about timeline, the largest parties in European Parliament now consider a conflict with Russia to be likely or even inevitable within the next 3 years. Hyperbole, but nonetheless it's okay. Russell's political determination to prepare for war is running up against stark economic realities. This again is TASS presenting EU in the same position which Russia finds itself against in its war against Ukraine, namely that it's running out of cash, it's running out of money and its facilities, and therefore it has a great deal of difficulty in actually maintaining the war without doing other things. Therefore, presenting the case to the Russian community, the Russian citizens, that there's a potential war against the EU means it can actually continue to tax them and charge them and actually build up its own weapons arms industry. So if we were to challenge the report simply, there is nothing new to the story. Since the end of World War II and the establishment of NATO and the European Union has resulted in European security for 80 years. Followed by the Cold War in 1947-91, the sole aggressor during this period has been Russia. Invasions of Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. The European Union, and therefore at the same time NATO, has not actually committed any form of aggression or attack on a country either associated with or connected to Russia. In response to negative and critical comments by the US President on NATO and the EU, plus a number of military and economic and political reports indicating the potential of war with Russia, both NATO and EU are reassessing the defence capabilities across Europe. This is being interpreted by Russia as an offensive move as opposed to defensive. Again, nothing new in the Russian position. Always the victim, enemies around every corner, attack being the best form of defense. It is not in the United States' interest to conduct active operations around the world alone. Instead, the US military will concentrate on the most important and dangerous threats to its country, according to the new version of the National Defense Strategy published on the Pentagon's website on January 23rd. Experts told the new strategy highlights Trump's dual focus on the Western Hemisphere and Indo-Pacific, framing Russia as a lasting but manageable threat and open to dialogue. I wonder if that's really true. The approach outlined in the new NDS includes defending the Western Hemisphere, deterring China and in the Indo-Pacific region, and shifting the burden among US allies and partners worldwide, and rebuilding the US defense industrial base. China is recognized as the world's second most powerful country after the United States, according to the document, and it drives Washington to maintain favorable balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific region, which makes sense. Nothing strange. Meanwhile, Russia is described as a persistent but manageable threat to NATO's eastern members in the near future. Quote, in the near future. So therefore, with this analysis and evaluation, it is only logical and therefore sensible for NATO and EU and others to prepare in the event of a invasion. It's the only way you can put it, isn't it? Aggression. The United States proposes that its allies assume a greater responsibility for ensuring their own security as the main guarantee of maintaining peace. Trump has again highlighted his two priorities, the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific region. Vladimir Pavlov, research fellow at MGIMO's Institute for International Studies, told the newspaper In his view, China will remain a priority regardless of the rhetoric, but Washington in this area appears to want greater manageability and to retain the initiative, including through unanticipated actions and stability and security. Makes a lot of sense. This is the Kremlin objective as opposed to reality. The US, which includes its president, cannot and will ignore the reality of potential Russian attack against NATO. As Putin draws your attention away from his real target, Trump does the same. That's all for now. From all of us at the Center for Russian Studies in Kiev, thank you. Share this podcast with your friends and those who you think who will be interested. The online address is Russia Unmasked. We'll be back with more news from Kiev soon. Until then, Slav Ukraini. Ukrainians were, are, and always will be here. Volodymyr Zelensky. Thank you.